Hi, my name is Tim Chrisman, Executive Director of the Foundation for the Future. Welcome to another edition of our Infrastructure for the Future webinar series, where we bring in an outside expert to discuss the various needs and challenges related to space infrastructure and discuss how that problem, gap, or other deficiency can be solved. And we do this in a relatively tight format, about an hour, and it is geared for you, decision makers on the Hill, in the executive branch, and in industry, to get a glimpse at the problems and potential solutions in an easily digestible and accessible fashion. We're joined here today for our appropriations related webinar by Kevin O'Connell, the former director of the Office of Space Commerce and current CEO of Space Rising LLC, a space consulting firm. Also joining us, government relations, John Chwat. And today we're going to be unraveling the complexity around the appropriations cycle as it relates to the space economy. I'm going to share some slides here to sort of cage all of us on what is this problem and complexity around the space economy and appropriations. And then I'll pass it over to you, Kevin, to talk about the inside view. What is it that you went through at the Office of Space Commerce and your time studying this? And then John and I will talk about some potential solutions and what FY22 and beyond are looking like. So to start off, I like to sort of orient people to the problem or what we're discussing. And there's a public perception that in space, it is a government-funded initiative, and it is a largely consistent sort of funding. So what I've got here is a handful of slides talking about public funding of commercial space. So while NASA's budget has remained fairly consistent over the years, if not keeping up with inflation, the projects that it is directed to spend its money on by Congress have varied, and that's resulted in ups and downs in public funding. And so the charts here show over time the amount of money going to the commercial space sector has increased, and it has increased in fits and starts, but has gone up. However, when you remove the big two, the SpaceX and Blue Origins, the picture becomes dramatically different in how much volatility there is for the majority of the commercial space industry in terms of what kind of money they're receiving and how they're receiving it. And so, I mean, for me, when I first saw this, it looks like the scales are the same even on these two charts, but they're an order of magnitude different. On the total public funding, it's in millions. The average funding charts in thousands. And so you can sort of see that. When you look at the types of investments across the different industries and sort of sectors of the space economy where this investment is going, you see a similar picture. You see that there are, again, sort of gradual growths, a couple hiccups, but when you then take out the launch sector, which has received most of the investment, you get to see there is, again, a dramatic set of variation year on year on where the money and how the money is being deployed. So we've started to examine this in public funding of private enterprise. And as we interact with many of you on this webinar, others on Capitol Hill and beyond, we're often asked, cool, but there's a lot of hype about new investments going into space. SpaceX just raised X number of dollars. What about this investment over here? And the narrative around that misses the point that there is money flowing into the space economy, and in some cases, a lot of money. However, what is missed is how, I have to go back to the word volatile, because that is what happens. We have private money flowing in as hypes are generated, and even those are not dramatic enough to create a sustained cycle of change or overcome the high barrier of entry to the space economy. And so we're left with a situation where there are high profile successes. SpaceX, Blue Origin, other players in the space economy have done exceptionally well and continue to attract investment. But those are unique outliers that almost illustrate the full extent of the problem more than highlight the success of the system. And as we look forward, is it sustainable to develop an entire sector of the economy in an entirely new domain of human existence with investment charts that look like heartbeat? My answer is no, but I'm in the space economy and so have an inherent bias. I think in general, we can do better. It's just a matter of how we do that. And there's always more to the story. And so let's hear from Kevin to talk a little bit more about the how and why and behind the scenes of what happens with this appropriation cycle.
Tim, John, thanks very much for having me today, and really excited to be part of this webinar. It is a very exciting time in the space economy. And of course, the short answer to your question is that federal appropriations are absolutely essential to what we're doing in space, whether it be space as a strategic place, space for space exploration, or of course, the growth of the space economy. And I think what's different, and you've shown some of this in the charts, I think what's different now is what we're seeing is a different set of relations between government and industry. And we have to take stock of that in what we're doing. And I'll talk about that in a couple of ways. Everybody on this webinar knows that the commercial aspects of space globally are roughly 80%, and that number is bound to grow. Governments are still important. They set priorities, they provide critical resources, et cetera. But the commercial aspects of this are changing rapidly. And in the United States, we're happy to benefit from a very diverse ecosystem of companies, entrepreneurs, finance, and other enablers, if you will, of the space economy. You know, to say that another way, and I think we'd have to dig deeper into your numbers to think about it, space is becoming a normal market in that sense. And so, we're seeing every kind of behavior, from successes and failures. We're seeing M&A activities. We're seeing new kinds of finance, different kinds of finance instruments. This is something we worked on in Commerce quite a bit. And so that's a normal set of developments. We're seeing exits, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a good thing. It also means that we can't overreact when somebody fails unless it's a critical function, at which point it should not have been only purely commercial, as it turns out. And so, in my time at Commerce, I spoke a lot about how the government in many ways had become a better customer than we'd seen over the years. Everything from the incubators, from the organizations that are able to quickly award younger companies, if you will, newer companies, with awards very, very quickly. And what that allowed them to do was to take a small seed investment from the government and then go out into the capital markets and get another test of both risk and reward and the potential for commercialization. And we're seeing that model being very successful. I've spent some time, even in my time since Commerce, from talking to some of the incubators in Europe, and we're seeing other countries around the world look at this at this incubator model. And so this seed funding piece is very different. And that, of course, comes from federal appropriations to provide early capital to companies that have an interesting idea, that have an idea that the government considers worth exploring, may not be part of the main programs, and then it gets a different test from the capital markets. And so I think one of the skills that I think we need to develop better as we think about federal appropriations, and the process, of course, is well known, and the planning for money, the spending of money, the execution in calendar years kind of thing. I think one of the things we have to do a lot better at is to anticipate things that are coming in the market. This is something we worked on at Commerce. We did it not only with the Department of Defense, our office, the Office of Space Commerce, but also DIU and AFWorks and others, because we were kind of the front edge of people coming into the market, folks that would show up and say, hey, we're working on this kind of capability. And so, if you will, sort of a front edge of what is coming in the market. Because the government at that point really needs to ask a couple of questions. What kinds of functions are coming in the market? How much? Are there 10 companies coming, or is there only one group of entrepreneurs that are coming? What kind of backing do they have? What's the state of the technology? And so I think all of those questions are helped by an early look deep into the market to understand what's coming. And again, organizations like the incubators, like the government organizations that are in the business of doing this can be very, very helpful for doing this. Again, a lot of discussions with our allies about what trends they were seeing, things coming into the market. They won't all succeed, we know that, but at least get a sense for what kinds of things were coming. Or on the other hand, of course, where federal appropriations apply, where is there, we'll call it a market failure for lack of a better term, where is there a place where there's no market or no market yet? And therefore, if the government needs a capability, it spends money on that capability. It may be in either a seed way or a major program way or whatever it would be. And so it's this new combination of government and private investment. I think that's a very interesting mix for us to explore in this conversation. We could take a couple of examples, on the lunar economy, for example. Number one, I'm very surprised at how many people think the next thing that happens on the moon is that 2 astronauts arrive there. When in fact, again, everybody here, I think, knows many, many, many other things are going to happen on the moon before that, whether it be mapping and exploration, landers and rovers, but even other ideas, concepts like data centers on the moon, things that might be done more efficiently on the lunar surface than they're done here on Earth, or differently. That's going to require some level of infrastructure. We're starting to hear people talk about things like PNT on the moon, an ability to navigate on the moon, communications on the moon. There's already a contract awarded for communications, possibly SSA for the moon. And so there will be an infrastructure aspect of that. Another dimension of the moon that I'm very interested in is the whole question of cybersecurity. I understand that my colleagues at Commerce and DHS ran an event a couple of weeks ago that was related to the space cyber nexus. And as I'm told, over 1,000 people attended that. And that's good, because that's a very important thing for all of the things we're going to do on the moon. We're going to need that data protection that's coming with that. Second, the topic near and dear to my heart, the space debris issue. Decades of U.S. investment, mostly on the Department of Defense side, but also NASA. What we try to do is to bring the private sector to bear on that, partly because the problem, and it's gotten only worse since we left, there's signals every day how important this is and how much this problem can upend a lot of our plans in space. How is the private sector able to deal with some of those problems today, especially on the SSA side, where we spent a lot of our own time? But also, how do we keep adapting to what the future environment will be there? Again, if we create a system that works in 2021, it'll be out of date very, very quickly, given the rapid changes in space. And so there's definitely an infrastructure aspect of that as well that we have to pay attention to. Mention a couple of other quick things, and we'll turn it back to you. One of the things we have to think about as we think about infrastructure is talent. You've heard me talk many times before about the talent for the space economy. There's so many aspects of the space economy that will drive not just the technical talent, but also a wide range of diverse skills, artists and business people and really a wide range of skills. We have to have the talent that will support any infrastructure that we build going forward. Good news is we had seen at Commerce, we even see more recently, a number of states that are historically not have been in the space business are really starting to pay attention to how they can participate in the space economy. In some ways, it's the same thing as when you look globally. A lot of countries that were not traditional space players are thinking about it as well. But in the United States, one of the things that folks are thinking about explicitly is what kind of talent base do they have in specific states, and how can they use that to their comparative advantage in participating in the space economy. And so that's a very exciting development. I've said for years now that every state in this great nation ought to be part of the space economy in some way, shape, or form. And we're starting to see every state think about it much more deliberately. The talent piece is absolutely critical. So why don't I turn it back over to you on that note, and look forward to the questions and the discussion.
Thanks, Kevin. I especially like the emphasis that every state be a space state. That's something that as we take our events on the road and are sort of exploring the underserved and left behind communities of the space economy that we talk about. We went to Scranton, Pennsylvania, and we're talking with the Chamber of Commerce and local leaders there about, look, Scranton has the talent pool to participate. This isn't just researchers. This isn't just rocket scientists. It is people with the grit, innovation, and drive and experience making things and figuring it out and doing. And the history of places like Scranton, like Akron, those are places that's what we need. And as we go to the moon, you're right, it's not just people playing golf and taking pictures, it's people setting up mining facilities and trying out new ways of living, working, and operating. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind.
Tim, I would just interrupt you for 1 second.
Yeah.
I think the most important thing there is for states, and we've been working with the governor's office in South Carolina. I've been talking to folks even this afternoon in the state of Wyoming. The important thing is to drive out what the state's comparative advantage are in this area. While I was at Commerce with our colleagues in ITA, we ran a couple of events up in Connecticut, which was really a broad gathering of industry, academia, political leaders, others, to really just have a simple conversation about the things they were doing today and places where they could actually move into the space economy. So it's not just a sort of willy-nilly, let's do this. It's let's sit down and have a deliberate conversation about what we have comparatively to take advantage of as we move into the many, many different aspects of the space economy.
Oh, yeah, completely agree. And so when we do our monthly conversations for the future events, we ask the presenters and the audience, hey, we're in this town. In June, we're going to be in Savannah. What you've presented is great. Your technology, your idea, your capability. How does this workforce, this state, this area use that? How can they play? How can they participate? And it absolutely is not showing up and waving. It's no, they can engage and should, because, we're at the point like in the 90s with the internet where there is a sense that it's weird talking about building on the moon. I grew up reading Tom Swift. It seems like that, but it's real. And in 20 years, we're going to look back and laugh about how weird it felt and how normal it is now.
Right.
Yeah. So up on the screen here, there is places, if you're watching this on one of the live streams, to drop questions in. Our team will relay them back here to us in the feed. But we're going to keep rolling, and I'll come back to this so we can continue to address questions if and when you all in the audience have them. So as Kevin and I were just talking about, there is a lot happening in space and in the space economy that is driving forward and is making great things happen. We see NASA landing rovers on Mars, and I will admit, I was bored by the landing because of how easy NASA made it look. And that is on me, and is a reflection of how good NASA has gotten landing robots on other planets. The question we have, and the thing we expect NASA to do, but is not part of their mandate, is developing out after they've explored. They're Lewis and Clark and the explorers of the ocean age seeking out new worlds. We also expect them to lay the railroad. And that's not their role, and that's not what we should expect. Space Force has just emerged as the new player in the space world, and they have the mandate to protect and defend us as another military service. And I've heard in dozens of conversations, whether explicitly or implicitly, that, well, if NASA's not doing it, then Space Force will handle it. And as a former Army officer, it is true. You hand a military unit rocks to paint, and they will paint them. But that distracts them from their primary job of defending the nation and protecting our way of life. And so there needs to be an element that helps with the creation of what our military is defending. And we look to the private sector for innovation and driving our technology base forward. And as Jeff Bezos has said in a number of interviews, he didn't make Amazon on his own. Amazon, full of its innovations and advancing the way we do retail and e-commerce, he says that wasn't just us. We needed a post office, we needed roads, we needed the basic backbone infrastructure that enabled our success. Where is that, and who is making that for space? And so to orient you all, I use this slide a lot because I like graphs and arrows and charts. And I use this to talk about where we are in the space community, in the space world, and where we're going. And we are at, or nearing, the point where a lot of marketing experts and researchers into change management, what they would call the peak of inflated expectations, or nearing this chasm between the leaders who are pushing technology and the rest of us, or the point when hype gets so much that we are going to be disappointed. And this has happened in the space economy before, after Apollo, when we knew for sure we would be all living in space by the year 2000. And what happened was the technology and the infrastructure to support continued momentum just wasn't there. And that caused the sort of backsliding, if you will. And what we're trying to do at the Foundation for the Future is prevent that from happening again. And our plan to do that is to enable those elements of government that are working the space economic problem to do their job better and smooth out the problems within the relationship between government and its appropriation cycle and the private sector. I like to talk about the different mandates of NASA and Space Force. We already more or less talked about them, and how the general idea of NASA being the only space entity in the US government is a commonly held misconception. I held that when I arrived at the CIA Space Department, ironically enough. and was quickly surprised to look across government and see every agency touching space somehow. And it was truly impressive to see. We talked about Space Force's mission and how its role really is the security guarantor of a free and fair system in space. And so what we at the foundation are proposing, and we have put a draft bill of this to Congress, and it's being considered in both the House and Senate for introduction, is the creation of a private federal corporation, an organization to unleash the private sector by using the tools developed over generations of federal trial and error, ranging from Tennessee Valley Authority to In-Q-Tel now, and recommit the government to space infrastructure development that was first signaled by Kennedy with COMSAT in the 1960s, where not only was there a decision to go to the moon, but there was also a decision made to lead the development of a global communications network that would benefit all of us. And this was done through a public-private cooperation, the creation of a private federal corporation that could develop this on its own without the need for ongoing appropriations from Congress and without the need for a heavy-handed regulatory approach to incentivize or discourage activity on the part of other players. So I threw in the obligatory joke about civil engineers here, not only to break up the flow, but also because I come from an engineering family. My dad was a mechanical engineer, and so this joke was repeated every time we met a new civil engineer, along with jokes about bridges and other rude ones about how they were no use to anyone in their entire profession because all they did was city planning. But the point remains that infrastructure investment is one of the best uses of government spending. There's been a long list of research studies from McKinsey to Deloitte that have looked at the effect of infrastructure investment as a comparison of other ways the government spends its money, and consistently, the return on investment for infrastructure spending from government far exceeds its cost. Usually it's $1.50 to $1.75 is returned to the economy for every dollar spent. In space, we argue the ratio is dramatically higher. And we argue that in part because repairing a road enables continued economic activity. Expanding a road enables a growth in existing economic activity. Building a whole new road creates a new market. And the return on that is dramatically more. And we like to cite GPS as an example of just such an initiative where infrastructure investment yielded a far outsized return on what the government spent. And the best part was that return was completely unrelated to its primary purpose. And so when government is looking at what kinds of infrastructure investments to make, both at home and in space, they need not only be looking at ways that will benefit the broader economy, but ones that have the dual use of helping advance existing government needs or allowing government to take an anchor tenant sort of position while also having an outsized effect elsewhere. And ultimately, what is needed to make space real is the ability to make it boring enough that large institutional investors, that large organizations feel they understand the risk enough to invest. Space technology is some of the most advanced and coolest tech out there, which means it is also high risk and not something that someone with a 100-year investment forecast wants to play with because they can't quantify the risk. And so what this space corporation would do is make things boring enough that it's investable. And related to what we're talking about here, it would smooth the political cycle out and the ups and downs, ebbs and flows of political appropriations to create the space infrastructure, the sort of roads and rails to space, while expanding employment and a sustainable path for employment nationwide. There doesn't need to be space coasts in the way there is now as the only centers of space life. Sure, the coasts are the best places to launch for a variety of missions, but that's not the case for everything about space. The making, the innovating, the developing, the shipping, everything from idea to orbital mechanics does not need to live in a handful of states. It should live nationwide. And this is where it's time. As we emerge from economic crises, from a pandemic, now is a chance to rebuild in a way that prepares us for the next century sustainably. We've hit on the Space Corporation a fair amount, and I don't want to belabor this because that's not really the point of this webinar. And so I want to hand it over to John here to talk more about the appropriation cycle and what that looks like and help us to continue unraveling this complexity.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Tim. As far as my background, I have been on Capitol Hill for over 4 decades. I'm very much involved in the funding and authorization process. We have limited time together, so I'd like to go as quickly as possible. Tim, do you have the slides? The first concept that I wanted to display is that we have two distinct processes in the Congress. One is appropriations and one is authorization. You can go to the second slide there. In the authorization process, I'd like to describe it in a very simple terms. If you have $1 that is appropriated, $1, the authorizing people are the ones that determine that $1, but the appropriators would determine, let's say, 50 cents from the dollar can actually be spent. So authorization and appropriations are two functions that we have. And to put it in context, now we're dealing with trillions of dollars in the budget. It's just an unfathomable amount of money. Even when we talk of billions, I don't think the average American understands that. But to put it in context, last year, when the federal government's budget was finally allocated, it was 4.8 trillion for what we call fiscal year, which begins October 1. It was late. And for the pandemics that we had that Tim referred to, approximately 6 trillion was allocated in 2020 and then a little bit in 2021. So you can see that the pandemics, which were all funded by Congress, was about 6 trillion, and our entire federal budget is 4.8 trillion. Now, in the appropriations process, there are several dynamics. First, in this new administration, the budget, the 4.8 trillion from last year, but the budget for the Biden administration is a little bit delayed. It'll come out next Thursday on the 27th of May. And that budget is Biden's reflections on what his request would be to Congress for what we call the fiscal 22 process. Now, that fiscal 22 process, which funds the federal government, begins October 1, and it'll be much delayed in that process. The second dynamic in the appropriation process is that we have a very divided Congress that allocates all the money for all these different programs. We have a virtual tie in the Senate, and in the House, it's almost a tie. It's 211 to 219 with 5 vacancies. So it's a very, very divided government, and the appropriation process reflects this. To show the timeliness of this discussion that we're having right now, Bill Nelson, who is the new administrator for NASA, will be up on Capitol Hill at 2 o'clock today, talking about his request for fiscal 22 funding for NASA. So this is a very timely topic. Now, for the funding that we're talking about, we have a particular schedule that the Congress tries to adhere to depending on events. I mentioned the fact that at the end of the month and for the next 2 months, there will be hearings in the House and Senate Appropriations Committee. They're very, very heavily membered committees. There's almost 60 members in House Appropriations and 30 in the Senate. They're very powerful. And they'll be holding hearings and marking up, which is actually creating bills that relate to funding various federal agencies through the end of July. And then they come back after Labor Day, and the beginning of our fiscal year is September 30th. And the what I call the end game is between October 1 and the end of the year, in which all bills have to be passed. And most probably we will encounter what's called a continuing resolution or an appropriation omnibus, which is 2, 3, or 4 thousands of pages with a huge amounts of funding, which will be in the fall. Next slide, please. Now, the purpose of this very short webinar is to explain the funding process as it relates to the Space Corporation Act. The ComSat Corporation was debated in Congress. It lasted 5 months, very, very quickly, in 1962, and it passed and was signed by President Kennedy, as Tim had indicated. The impetus for Congress speeding up the creation of this private federal corporation during that period was the Yuri Gagarin was the Soviet cosmonaut that flew around the Earth before Glenn, the Sputnik before that, the impact of NASA and the Apollo program, and especially Kennedy's speech during the State of the Union, which, by the way, this Monday is the 60th anniversary of when President Kennedy went before Congress in 1961 and said, we're going to put a man on the moon and we're going to devote considerable resources for space. So this was the first effort, because at that time, you could not see a video, TV, around the world, and you could not pick up a telephone and call Paris or Tokyo. And America was prime in the development of this corporation to create an international satellite communications system. And it did that within 13 years. And so this is the most relevant precedent for Congress to consider in what Tim had outlined before. Now, the ComSat Act, or at least the Space Corporation Act, is patterned after the ComSat Act signed by President Kennedy. The IPO that I have here in the in this listing, within 1 year, according to the bill that passed at that time, the main drivers at that time was AT&T and Hughes, and a lot of other corporations. But the IPO was issued, and it immediately attracted, in American dollars right now, about $2 billion in stocks very, very quickly. And CommSec Corporation also became the prime contractor for both the military and for the civilian sector, much in what Kevin was talking about as well. In fact, this corporation became a contractor for the government. So the IPO for CommSec Corporation is also patterned after the Space Corporation Act that we have. Now the act itself, and I will say that Tim has attached to this document a much more detailed description of the appropriation process. It's an article that I wrote, and so you're free to look at that. And if you request it, we certainly will give you copies of the draft bill that we have. But in our option in the Space Corporation Act that is out there, we have a provision that, of course, the president nominates the board of directors, and the nomination of this board of directors is heavily based on not just the qualifications, but also the investments that members of that board of directors would make in the corporation, and also the financing. The financing of projects is very, very important. In our Title IV, we have various types of financing mechanisms that have been talked about over the years that the corporation can achieve. One of them, and we won't go into detail on this because we don't have time, but one of them is space bonds, which is a very popular discussion. And another is a space commodity exchange possibility, commercial development loans, space grants, academic research grants to supplement whatever the National Science Foundation, and many, many other options. Included in the bill also is a provision that lists about 25 to 30 different types of projects that a corporation like this could fund over a long term. And long-term investment, just like Tim was mentioning, is a key aspect to the venture capital and to the investment options that the corporation will bring, usually 10 years or more. And so these options are in there. Next slide, please. So to put a little bit of context, again, in our limited time, the Space Force last year, within that broad $4 trillion budget, last year had $15 billion. And again, to put it into context, I've listed here the DSA, the Defense Space Agency, which forms a sort of a contractual area for contracts, R&D contracts a lot in the space architecture. Their budget last year was $48 million. And the NASA budget that Tim alluded to last year was $23 billion, which he is correct. Over a period of 2 or 3 years, it's gone from 21 to 22 to 23 billion. And President Biden sort of not leaked it, but sort of has recommended at least 24.7 billion for NASA. Now, there's many other agencies, as Kevin has alluded to, that has components. In fact, his former Commerce Department has components, and NTIA, FCC. The alphabet soup is ripe with funding that appears for space projects. But again, to put all of this in context, these budgets that I just referred to are small compared to the kind of funding that that Tim had mentioned overall that would be needed. Next slide, please. There are many, many challenges. I discussed late last night with Tim the fact that Senator Schumer just last night introduced a composite bill of 1,450 pages. And within that bill is the what's called the Endless Frontier Act. Maybe he took it from our name, I don't know. But in the Endless Frontier Act, that is the NASA authorization bill, in which they included in this 1,400 pages many bills, and that's pending on the Senate floor right now, and it will be resolved probably in the next week or so. But I wanted to highlight very briefly in section 677 of this 1,400-page bill, it says that it's directed against China. And it says NASA and OSTP at the White House and the National Space Council cannot do any collaboration with the People's Republic of China, and no Chinese company can be hosted. And there's a bunch of other provisions. There's a section 678 that says that NASA, no contract can be, and of course there's a waiver in there for Chinese companies. And there's other provisions that deal with the supply chain and other Chinese related issues. So I would suggest that people look at that. Chinese space funding, very important. To put it in context, estimated last year about $12 to $13 billion, but their space program is under the control of the military and the Communist Party in Beijing. China National Space Administration. Their space race is similar to the Soviet space race, but even more focused. Men on the moon, colonization, probes to Jupiter, and very concerning national security interests, which propel our need for increased American participation. One last comment about international. Japan, 4.1 billion last year, indicating all 10 or 11 of their ministries combined, the government interjected in a 23% increase in their space program. So America is, of course, has much more resources, but we have others that are challenging us. As a bottom line, the congressional process is speeding up. It is what I call front-loaded, meaning that a lot of appropriations and authorization policies, funding, will be decided either before the summer or definitely by the fall and winter. And then there's one more cycle for fiscal 23, which begins October of next year. That budget, fiscal 23, is being finalized in the next 8 months within the agencies. They'll be presented to Biden, and that'll be presented for the next State of the Union. And then there's the 2022 election, so we'll see what happens there. So Tim, that's my presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you, John. So I'll leave up the places where our viewers can drop in questions. The first question is for you, Kevin. Thank you for being here. In your experience in the Department of Commerce, you advocated for expanding the Office of Space Commerce, and that was a challenging experience. Was that harder or easier than creating an entirely new organization? In many ways, it seemed harder.
So I think that first of all, thank you for the question. I think that I don't know if it was easier or harder than creating a new organization. People sometimes thought it was a new organization, but in fact, most know that it was actually created over 30 years ago when commercialization was a twinkle in folks' imagination at the time. I think the point of the elevation that we had lobbied for was really the point about leveraging the entire department on behalf of the U.S. commercial space industry. OSC historically, by law, was the executive branch advocate for commercial space in conducting that, and really is something that had been seeded long before I arrived. The idea of leveraging the entire department toward that aim was really something that we strive for. And if there was ever a time for this office to reach its stride, it is now, given the importance of this industry to our national security, to our economic aims, et cetera, given the strategic issues that John just touched on briefly a couple of minutes ago. And so bringing the whole Commerce Department to bear on this was really one of our goals. And I think we did it. We in fact did it. So I wouldn't guess whether it was harder to start a new organization or leverage this one going forward. But that was what we were trying to do, and I think that will continue on. Obviously, it's this part of the space domain is an economic conversation as much as it is anything else, and the Commerce Department needs to play a very strong role in that.
Yeah, and sort of a follow-up to that, there's a lot of different government programs to help startups and small businesses catch their stride. It was and is that a role for the Office of Space Commerce, or was that different?
No, it's a really good question. In fact, I believe it was in October of 2019 that we held an event attended by over 200 organizations, literally packed the auditorium at Commerce. It was affectionately called the Unique Challenges of Early Stage Space Businesses. And it was partly designed to point entrepreneurs to companies' activities. And I think we created a website after that to try to help entrepreneurs, to point them to other US government opportunities for that. And so that's very much the kind of role. Again, in my time at Commerce, we saw companies, and I've said before, I never liked old space, new space labels, because we saw innovation coming from throughout the space industry in the United States. And we saw everything from the larger companies coming in to say they had a certain capability to the entrepreneurs that looked like they'd been, as I like to say, in a garage for 6 weeks without much food. And we loved all of those people. And so the help there was to point them to either government programs or other activities that they might be able to take advantage of.
Yeah, us here at the foundation have tried to emulate what you did there at the Office of Space Commerce, not necessarily funding small businesses or organizations, but trying to connect them to resources. Absolutely. And be that enabler that smooths the friction out, because, we saw the success you had as a relatively small organization making a huge impact because there is so much friction that exists. That sort of enabling function may not matter in a sector of the economy where it is easy to already find everything and easy to get into. But in space, that is not the case. And so that has been a hugely important function that I think the Office of Space Commerce has filled.
Thanks, Tim. Tim, the other thing I would mention is on regulatory issues. Companies would also knock on the door to either help understand, the explicit aspects of regulation, and then there are the tacit rules of regulation. And so that's another area where I hope the current administration continues the momentum that we created in trying to modernize the regulatory regime that we have for innovative space activities. So that's another dimension of things that we did while in the office, helping companies break regulatory log jams where they were stuck, talking to them about how the government would typically interpret a specific regulation. And in many ways, what's interesting about this, sorry to belabor it, but in many ways, the government today regulates things that it is well familiar with for decades. Regulation of remote sensing, it's a business that the government has understood for decades. People are now bringing to market a whole new set of capabilities for which the government does not have a distinctly unique advantage and understanding how to regulate them. And so you want to be able to balance the interests of the entrepreneur with legitimate safety and security issues as well.
Yeah, no, I'm reminded of seems unrelated, but the cigarette executives advocating that their ads be pulled from the airwaves during a address to Congress, where they were called in to ask why they were advertising and whether Congress should outlaw cigarette ads on TV. And they said, the cigarette executive said, absolutely, definitely do it. And it was because of the fair broadcasting rules that required equal time on TV, and the government was regulating radio, but we're doing it on television and doing it in, doing what they understood, but with entirely new mediums, and the private sector, in this case, to the detriment of the health of a lot of Americans, were able to get around that. And I think your point is especially important. John, and a question I think is directed for you. How is it the Space Corporation would actually remove the need for federal appropriations? Isn't this a new federal agency?
Very quickly, because we have limited time, it is not a federal agency. It is considered a unique public-private federal corporation. It's organized under the U.S. Code. It's permitted. The corporation would act just like a regular corporation would. And according to past precedent, a lot of projects that Kevin has mentioned and you have mentioned that are contracted by DOD and by NASA and by many, many others, including innovative new projects that are listed in our proposed draft, would be funded by private investment, venture capital, and a significant increase in a return on investment, long-term financing, attractability for investment, and that would significantly change the appropriation funding. The bottom line is, when you visualize a colony on the moon, or you visualize the things that Kevin is talking about, we're at the cusp of the private sector being unleashed. And I'll give you one stupid example. I apologize, but when the Transcontinental Railroad was first created, it was Congress who allocated a small grant per mile for the two companies to meet at the appointed place to create the Transcontinental Railroad. How much return on investment did the railroad bring to the United States and the West? We're at the same place right now with space.
Yeah, and I think this last question here sort of builds on it, and I'll try to answer it. The question is, how will the Space Corporation accelerate the growth of the space industry? And I think it gets to what you're talking about there with the Transcontinental Railroad, John, that right now in space investing, you either have patient capital from government that will take long-term views of its investments, but ultimately there is uncertainty around whether or not those programs will continue year on year based on elections, administrations changing, and the like. But the alternative right now for the space economy is venture capital, which is inherently impatient, wants an exit within 5 to 7 years, but will give you a stable source of money. And so it almost seems like a devil's bargain for space companies. Either we take a long-term view and are able to get that contract with the government that may be canceled, may not, or we're trying to finish everything in 5 to 7 years and win. And what the Space Corporation would create is a third mechanism for funding, a 10+ year investment window where you have a stable source of investment that is also patient, that is looking out and recognizing, much as the KKRs and BlackRocks are now, that the first 10 to 15 years of an infrastructure investment are probably going to be losses. But it's from that point on that revenue starts to come in, that the long-term perspective of these investors is able to start generating a return that continues for decades. And this is exactly the sort of tool that the space economy lacks, and that is uniquely lacking in the space economy. We have these tools that develop ports, schools, bridges, airports, and we don't for space. And so it is a sort of unique missing tool that we're trying to push for here.
Tim, could I just make one quick comment? I
Please.
apologize. During a hearing on Capitol Hill, chaired by Jamal Bowman, the new congressman from New York, the foundation was instrumental in securing the fact that a study that the foundation made available on graphene, which was a brand new building material, was highlighted during that study. And the reason I bring this up is that China has focused on graphene. England has focused on graphene, and it is a revolutionary technology on concrete and the like. You can look that up. And that's the kind of project that the corporation would be tremendously involved in, to transfer graphene and to compete with China in their desire to utilize such a technology, perhaps in a military sense.
Yeah. So it looks like we don't have any more questions, so we'll end here a little early. Kevin, do you have any closing remarks?
Let me just, I'll key off something that John has mentioned now twice, and it's the international dimensions of this. We're at a very unique point in time in the history of our pursuits of space. On the one hand, we have a number of mature space powers that are trying to adjust regulatory regimes, investment, the things we're talking about, for a world that is changing very, very rapidly because of the press of technology. On the other hand, we have a number of other countries who want to participate. I mean, there's a reason that COPUOS is such a large, it's the largest UN technical subcommittee. And in my discussions with many different countries overseas, they're as interested in this for the economic benefits as they are for the exploration benefits. Again, everybody's excited about exploration, but many countries are thinking about this as a driver of economic growth and innovation and the development of a highly skilled workforce. And so I think one of the things that we can do is that the government can use some unique, I'll call it infrastructure for this part of the conversation, to encourage partnerships. We held with state back in 2019, we held something called the Space Enterprise Summit, which was all about the nature of partnerships going forward. And it was one of the saddest things for me to have to cancel it last year because of COVID, obviously. But what was the nature of partnership going forward in terms of government to government, government to industry, and even purely commercial? One of the things that we can do is use unique US government capabilities, perhaps infrastructure as you're describing it, as a way of encouraging partnerships in partnership with traditional space allies and the private sector. It was a larger group that we had envisioned participating in this. And so the international dimension of this is not to be underestimated in any way, either because of the competition we're in with the Chinese and others, but also because it's the right thing to do, frankly.
Yeah, and I think the building of those public-private partnerships and the bringing together of those organizations is an important tool that government has, whether it's with the Office of Space Commerce or elsewhere in government. That is a way that these relatively small government offices have had dramatically outsized effects, and a sort of important lesson on both sides of the public-private divide that we really can do a lot more together
Right.
Let's figure out how that can work. So yeah, once again, Kevin, thank you so much for being here. It was great having you on for this talk. I look forward to seeing what you're able to accomplish next. You had impossible tasks handed to you every day at the Office of Space Commerce. And so I'm sure it has only gotten easier. And so I'm excited to see the results going forward. Thank you, John, for your wisdom that I'm told dates back to Andrew Jackson. So thank you.
George Washington.
Yes, yes. Yes, I wrote a update about being in the room where it happened with Hamilton, and I assume you were, in fact, in that room. So,
But yes, I would.
so thank you, and I look forward to talking more with you later. And for viewers, thank you for watching. We'll see you at our next Infrastructure for the Future event next Wednesday. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.